Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I'm your host, Megan Lewis, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Egyptologist Dr. Jill S. Waller. Jill is also a really good friend of mine, so this is going to be so much fun. Jill has a PhD in Egyptian art and archaeology from Johns Hopkins University. Her personal research is in burials from the Middle Kingdom through New Kingdom periods, and she has taught on a wide range of ancient topics, including the hieroglyphic Middle Egyptian language for several years. She's teaching Middle Egyptian for Digital Hammurabi as well. We'll be starting a new course cycle of that in the new year. So if you're interested in that, join the mailing list, which is on my website, digitalhammurabi.com. And the reason we are here today is because Jill has very kindly agreed to teach a 6-course lecture series on ancient Egyptian mythology. So, Jill, thank you very much for joining me today. I want to open by asking the question I ask everyone to begin with. What first sparked your interest in ancient Egypt, and did you always want to be an Egyptologist?
Well, like many female Egyptologists of my generation, and probably male too, I first fell in love with ancient Egypt through the Amelia Peabody series written by Elizabeth Peters. And basically, it's a series of mystery books. I'm a huge mystery book fan. And I read them first when I was like 11 years old, at which point they were still being published, and quickly realized that I was more interested in what the archaeologists were digging up than whatever mystery they were trying to solve. So that kind of told me, that was what I was interested in. And then I also found out that Elizabeth Peters, who wrote the books, that is a pseudonym for Barbara Mertz, who is actually an Egyptologist. And
No way.
yeah, she is a published Egyptologist and, ended up writing books that were New York Times bestsellers and everything. But so that's why the archaeology in the books was so accurate and so compelling.
That's really interesting. I had no idea. It's fascinating to me when people kind of make that shift from academia to fiction writing. The woman who wrote these 2 books here, Emily Wilson, her mother was an archaeologist. She's a science journalist, but she kind of had this, like you, love of archaeology from a young age and has used it in her writing. That's really, really cool. So we're talking today about ancient Egyptian mythology. I wanted to ask you how you think it compares to other mythologies. Is there anything that makes a myth kind of quintessentially Egyptian?
I mean, like any mythology of any culture, it does depend on certain quintessential aspects of that culture, right? So that's why in our first lecture in the course, I'm actually going to be giving an introduction not only to the pantheon, so that there's a brief overview of the gods, but also some aspects of Egyptian culture that will be seen in most of the myths, and that if you don't really understand, you're going to be very confused throughout the rest of the course. These include things like, the concept of Ma'at, that everything has to be in order and chaos is the worst thing. And even just, the ideas of, how the world is made up, that sort of thing. So actually a later lecture will go into that in more detail, that sort of thing. But also one thing that I love about ancient Egyptian mythology and ancient mythologies in general is basically the non-judgment, that if they come into contact with other mythologies, it's just kind of incorporated and pulled in. And that's really common throughout the ancient Near East or the ancient world in general. I mean, look at Greece and Rome. But even in ancient Egypt itself, that was a huge thing because different cities had different important gods and that sort of thing. And they just kind of allowed them to interplay with each other.
That's actually relates to a question I had for later on, whether there are regional differences. Do you see very distinct mythological traditions, or do they get interwoven into one like generic Egyptian mythological system?
Yes, both. Again, that's part of that idea. And with that even, so for example, different cities, a few different cities had different creator gods. Like literally which god created the universe, different in different cities. Heliopolis, it's Ra. Memphis, it's Ptah. etc. And in ancient Egypt, cool. They didn't fight about it. They were just like, okay, either different aspects of the same god or different versions, whatever, cool.
We don't care. It's all fine. Do you see like different family structures depending on what city you're in? Like, are different gods, or are gods married to different people, or parents to different people depending
Yes.
on where they are?
Yeah. There are times when different gods have different consorts, but again, then those consorts are usually considered to be different aspects of different gods. And especially with like a lot of the female gods, the goddesses often are in some ways not interchangeable, but they take on each other's roles and that sort of thing. So, and also with different mythologies, the roles change. And again, it's, you kind of imagine that the ancient Egyptians were like, that's the god stuff, it's above us. But things like, okay, Hathor and Horus. So in some versions, Hathor is the consort of Horus, and even there's a huge mythological thing with Dendera and Edfu, and the procession between the two. But in other ones, Hathor is basically his wet nurse, or even a stand-in for his mother Isis, or even his mother in some cases, but more commonly it's Isis. So these kind of interplayed, and with that, the idea of different aspects, different gods being different aspects of the same god, is kind of core to a lot of the mythology.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the main characters of Egyptian myth? You've mentioned a couple of them, but just for people who maybe aren't familiar with it.
Yes. So, there's, of course, this main sun god Ra, but also, again, then there's multiple sun gods who are all different aspects of the same sun, and, but all separate in their own things. There's also kind of like the main big family of, Isis, Osiris, Horus, also, Set, who in modern culture is often portrayed as evil because he was the first murderer, which we'll talk about. But then there's also some of my favorites like Hathor, Sekhmet, even just also some other gods who, depending on your terminology, are not necessarily even gods, but play more of a role in the household, like Bes, who is kind of a protector deity, but some would call him even a demon rather than a god.
I had a really great question sparked by something you just said, and it's flown out of my head. So we're going to move on with the questions I've already prepared, and hopefully it rematerializes. We'll see. Possibly not, but we'll try. It'll wake me up at 3 a.m. and I'll send you a Facebook message. Now, do we know what roles mythology played in ancient Egyptian culture? Was it like religious, primarily literary? What's going on? Do we even know?
So in some ways we don't know, but in a lot of ways we do, and they did play quite a large role in daily life with different aspects. Like, as I said, Bes is more of a protector god. He would have been seen in the house. He would have been on daily objects. We have even like headdress with him and other things to protect people from bad dreams. Or even there were a lot of examples where myths were told as part of medical practice, basically telling a story of something similar that happened to a god in a way to magically try to help heal, in addition to the actual physical medical practices. So it was something that came into every aspect of daily lives, so far as we can tell. Again, we'll never quite know. But that is also something that we will be talking more about in the course planned for next year on religion in ancient Egyptian life. Whereas this course will be more focused on just kind of the stories and the kind of immaterial aspects of it.
What is your personal favorite myth?
Destruction of mankind, Eye of Ra.
What happens?
Well, so cheap version is that basically Ra gets pissed off with humanity. And so he decides, I'm done with them, sends off his daughter, the Eye of Ra, who in different myths, different goddess, Hathor, Sekhmet, again, different versions of the same goddess or different aspects. And decides to send them off, go destroy humanity. But then he decides to forgive them for one reason or another. And one version, Hathor cheers him up, and now that he's not in a bad mood, he decides mass murder is bad. But whatever reason, he decides maybe not the best idea. So they go and try to stop the goddess, but she's like, no, I want to kill. So instead, they decide to fill an entire lake with beer and dye it blood red, lead her to it, and kind of trick her into thinking it's blood. So she drinks it all up and gets so drunk, she forgets that she wants to kill all of mankind. And thus we have the Festival of Drunkenness, which is celebrated to celebrate that the goddess did not kill mankind.
I like that. Festival of Drunkenness, mankind's not completely destroyed. Excellent. Good outcome.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different versions, different aspects, but that's kind of, as I said, kind of the cheap version of it.
When you're looking at Egyptian mythology through like a chronological time frame, do you see some myths being more popular during different time periods?
Yes, yeah, they do change over time. Now, also one thing though is we don't know too much about earlier periods, so we kind of have to rely on the religious texts like the pyramid texts and coffin texts, which kind of often don't actually spell out the whole myth for us. They just kind of allude to it. Like they expect you to know what they're talking about. And that is a bit frustrating. So in later periods, we do get more written out versions of some myths, like the contendings of Horus and Seth. But for a long time, we just kind of get these bits and pieces and hints, and we have to use these later versions to kind of look back. With that, though, we also definitely see like certain types of objects more popular in different periods. So votives for, say, the goddess Hathor or that sort of thing. Or in Thebes is a great example too. For a long part of the early part of the history, the main god of Thebes was Montu. And then Amun came along and he became the main god of Thebes. And everything just kind of totally shifted. Montu was still there, but he became mainly a war god, as opposed to like a main god. So these shifts definitely do happen over time, but it made sense when you think about the fact that we're talking about 3,000 years of history. And trying to, kind of boil that down into what happened, considering that a lot of historians have trouble boiling down American history, taking 3,000 years is a larger issue.
I can see that being quite tricky. And we've had a question from the YouTube chat, actually, which is really useful here. What are the primary sources for the myths? Are we looking at stone carvings? Are they handed down through other cultures? How do we know about them?
So a lot of the myth, as I said, we've got a lot of religious texts that kind of, indicate to it, the pyramid texts, coffin texts, Book of the Dead, that sort of thing. And again, sometimes they're not even telling us the whole myth. They're just kind of giving us hints by almost expecting us to know. But other times, as I said, like in more literary senses, we've got stories like the contendings of Horus and Seth, that sort of thing. Those are more from later periods, later New Kingdom, that sort of thing. But also there are some where we do basically still today rely on kind of like Greek versions or that sort of thing, because they are useful and they do kind of fill in some of the gaps from the little hints we have earlier on.
I think one of the more frustrating things about studying ancient cultures is that no one writes as if you don't understand what they're writing about, because there's this like shared knowledge. I'm not going to write a letter to you and explain what a president is because you know what a president is. You're American. You're familiar with this concept. But someone reading my letter in 3,000 years' time might not know. And they're going to have to do a whole load of research to work out what the hell I'm talking about when I talk about an election or a president. We have to deal with the same thing.
Yep, pretty much.
Now, do we see Egyptian mythology? You said that they adopted occasionally outside influences. Do we see them adopting like whole gods, or do they
Yes.
take themes and motifs? Oh, okay. Can you give us an example?
Well, my favorite example is definitely, and again, they just kind of incorporate them. But they basically took the Canaanite god Baal and said, okay, he's another version of Set. And we even have the 400-year stela where Set is dressed like the Canaanite god Baal. um, so they definitely pulled these things in. We also have a late Egyptian text, Astarte in the Sea, and definite Near Eastern origin to that.
I'm gonna say, don't think Astarte is an Egyptian name.
Yeah,
It
no.
might be. I don't think so.
So again, they just kind of pulled these things in. We're like, okay, cool. They might be different aspects, or they might interplay with their own gods. But yeah, and again, that's just something you see, as you're probably aware, in a lot of ancient religions, where just kind of pull them all in.
So related to that is another YouTube question. Which Egyptian gods were of Hyksos origin?
So yes, the Set Ball combination would be the biggest example of that. The Hyksos, unfortunately, didn't really give us a whole lot of indication of their gods. We assume that they were mainly Canaanite gods, especially from the archaeology at their capital, Avaris, Toledaba. And there we have different aspects which indicate to us that, yeah, they probably also worshipped, yeah, like Baal, Astarte, different gods there. There were also like horse burials, different aspects of Canaanite culture. So we assume that they pulled those in. And again, then the 400-year stela was actually during the beginning of the 19th dynasty. And that was placed at Avaris, which then in the 19th dynasty, there was the capital made next to it, P. Ramesses. So that they were kind of pulled in that way, but a lot of that, unfortunately, we just don't have a whole lot of indications.
So you don't see like a flooding of Egyptian literature with Canaanite figures and things?
No, the Hyksos, at least outside of their little bubble, seem to try to present themselves as, valid Egyptian rulers. So we know they definitely were not originally Egyptian by their names, by, again, the archaeological evidence at Avaris, that sort of thing. But they put their names on scarabs and built in Egyptian style, and they seem to want to portray themselves as basically as legitimate as possible so that, they could live in their own little bubble.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question from YouTube from a different Megan to me. Hello, Megan, who says she's all signed up for the class and is super excited. But she wants to know, as an Egyptologist, what are the biggest misunderstandings or misconceptions you fight against regarding ancient Egyptian culture, religion, or life?
Oh, I mean, the whole aliens thing comes to mind. Also,
you mean the pyramids aren't spaceships? I'm shook, absolutely shook.
Sadly, no. Which also, unfortunately, that those theories come from very racist origins, and so that also, leads into a lot of the issues about conceptions of ancient Egyptian race and debates about that, and quite frankly, all that's exhausting. But then there are also funner ones where, like, that ancient Egyptians worship cats, which is not entirely what was going on. Even the section of Herodotus that idea comes from is talking about animals that were connected to the ancient Egyptian gods in general. It doesn't just talk about cats. It talks about ibises and falcons and things like that. It's more about those animals' connections to certain gods, not that, everybody had an altar to a cat in their front room.
different to today, where many people do have an altar to the cat in their front room.
You know, I totally would have an altar to my cat. So.
I mean, I'm not sure what else a cat tree is, if not like a cat altar. So I'm happy with this classification.
Fair enough.
Now, are you talking about animals has just sparked the question that I forgot, so it's not going to wake me up at 3 or 4 a.m. I wanted to ask, we see a lot in Egyptian drawings, artwork, depiction of gods, and I think this is a really enduring image that a lot of people are familiar with, are animal-headed deities. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask, what's going on there? Are deities understood as having animals, or is this trying to show two different forms of a single entity?
So basically what that is trying to show is more that ancient Egyptians didn't know how the gods looked. But they imagined these gods as having certain aspects, which then certain animals reminded them of. So in order to visualize these gods, they had them appear with aspects of those animals. And this is also why different gods have different animal forms, right? I mean, Thoth can be an ibis or a baboon. But, you know, you generally see him as one or the other, or an ibis-headed man, again, because there are aspects of humanity in there too. It's more of a visualization of the idea of those gods. So for example, even with why so many goddesses are feline, that's because a lot of those goddesses have aspects that are traditionally associated with cats. They're graceful, they're very protective, especially over their house and their young. Just in general, they protect the house too. I mean, in ancient Egypt, part of the reason why cats were so abundant was because it was useful to have them to keep away mice from grain storage and that sort of thing. So it made sense that, you know, goddesses who epitomized women as the head of the household would take on feline aspects.
Excellent. Thank you. That is a question I've had since I was a child, actually. So I'm glad to finally have an answer. Why I didn't ask this sooner, I don't know, because we've been friends for more than a decade at this point. I could have just said, Jill, I'm an idiot. Sorry. Thank you for answering my question, though. And I have two more questions. One is, I think, an easy-ish one. What surprises people the most when you talk about Egyptian mythology?
Again, the cat thing comes to mind. But generally also, people tend to think of ancient Egyptian mythology and like ancient mythologies in general as like some sort of other. It's kind of got this whole magical element in their mind, which it does in ancient Egyptian culture, but in a different sense. It's more that people have for thousands of years and will continue to be for thousands of years, be people. People are people. And so the myths, they're not like a lot of modern religions where they envision the gods as being some untouchable aspect out there that all encompassing, that sort of thing. The gods act very similar to people, just like ancient Greek gods, ancient gods from a lot of cultures, but also the ideas in the myths are a lot of times things that people can relate to today. People have always been people. And that's just something that I've found a lot of students don't expect.
I get the same thing whenever I talk about Gilgamesh. I did a career day for my local elementary school last year and was talking to them about Gilgamesh, and they're like, wow, this is like really relatable. I understand how these people I was like, yeah, I mean, people are people. These people a long time ago without electricity and the internet, but they're still people. They have the same concerns and worries that you and I do. It's one of my favorite things about the ancient world actually is finding those commonalities that just are there throughout the whole of history. Now, my final question, is about the course, because you're going to be teaching, as I said, a 6-week course on Egyptian mythology. If people are interested, there's a link in the video description that has registration details and just more information about what the course includes and when it will be taking place. The live version will be starting on November 16th at 2 p.m., but it's going to be recorded and uploaded. So even if you miss the live version, you can still buy and watch the course in its entirety. So I wanted to ask you if you'd give us a brief overview of the kinds of things you'll be covering. I know you've mentioned several things while we've been chatting.
Yeah, so the very first class, again, I'm just going to give kind of an overview, an introduction to ancient Egypt and the pantheon in general, just kind of, what each god's role was, but also those main important concepts of ancient Egyptian culture that we'll see throughout all of the mythology. Then we're going to move on in the next course to the creation of the universe, because where to start other than the beginning, and just also how that affected how the ancient Egyptians thought the world was made up. Why is there air between the earth and the sky? That sort of thing. The third class, we will talk about the possibly most famous ancient Egyptian myth of the murder of Osiris, and then the fight for the throne of Egypt between Set and Horus. Then in the fourth class, we'll get to my favorite topic, the goddesses, and this is where we'll go more into the destruction of mankind and the distant goddess and the role of goddesses as the Eye of Ra, that sort of thing. Then from there, we'll move on to the fifth class will be about the kind of the cosmic order, almost how mythology explains the day-to-day. So this is going to be about like Ma'at, the order of the world, but also we're going to touch upon like stories about the Nile flood, the different stars and constellations, that sort of thing. Things that people can see and thus come up with stories about, but are, not necessarily fuller myths and longer, dramatic stories, just kind of day-to-day life myths. And then finally, we will end with the journey through the underworld and talking about what goes on in the afterlife. This is just going to be a very brief overview because, quite frankly, I can and have previously taught entire classes about the ancient Egyptian afterlife. So, if people really love that, maybe we can teach a class about that later in 2025.
I think we will definitely see if that sounds interesting to people. I was actually going to let you go now, but we've had a flurry of questions come in through YouTube. So we're going to address some of those before we finish up. First up, Egypt and Sumer have completely different beliefs about the afterlife. Why do you think that two neighboring cultures that are so close to each other have such different beliefs?
Honestly, I think it has to do with circumstances. So, again, I'm mainly versed with ancient Egyptian culture. I mean, I did take a lot of classes on the Near East and Sumer and that sort of thing in grad school, but mainly about ancient Egypt. And in ancient Egypt, again, a lot of their religion is based on kind of day-to-day life. And their number one thing that they wanted was for the entire country to be unified and for everything to be order, peace. Ma'at is a huge thing throughout their entire culture. So it then made sense that then a lot of their ideas of the afterlife involve, living up to that ideal, having your heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at, that sort of thing. Also, then the sun is an extremely important part of the religion, Ra, as he journeys throughout the sky and the afterlife, again, because, well, mainly it's a desert. So of course the sun's going to be important. But There's also a lot of historical basis for some of these things, as we'll talk about in the whole murder of Osiris class. There's even some historical basis in the early dynastic period for the whole fight between Horus and Set. So my main answer that I'm coming back to is that it's probably based on circumstance and the political makeup of the country and how the people there are living.
I would say also that I don't know how much contact there was between Egypt and Sumer in early history when these ideas would have been developing.
Yeah,
I know a lot
there's
of
definitely
trade later on. Yeah.
Which we definitely have archaeological evidence for. I mean, there's objects in Egypt that could not have been mined in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there are images that, you know, definitely have aspects in both the whole man fighting off beasts and that sort of thing. There's too similar to have not come from some
I see,
sort
yeah.
of habitat. Now, that being said, did Sumer just give Egypt culture? No. That is one thing that I've seen before, and no, they didn't just give Egypt culture or writing or that sort of thing. It definitely developed on its own. But
Mm-hmm.
this is also something that we see in multiple areas of the world where multiple cultures arise at the same time, like not necessarily right next to each other, but close enough that there's some contact.
Mm-hmm.
So probably something like that going on too.
Okay, cool. Thank you. We have another question from Megan. She says, animal imagery is so ubiquitous in the mythology, but what other animals did ancient Egyptians interact with in daily life, and in what ways, other than the cats that we talked about already?
So in daily life, they would have seen animals everywhere. And again, this does come out in their mythology, like jackals in the desert. And we see jackal gods like Anubis and that sort of thing. And at that time, there would have been crocodiles and hippos in the Nile. So we also see that in stories and in mythology. Even little things like in the language, since the one of the main scripts in ancient Egyptian language was hieroglyphic. You can see a lot in the vocabulary of the different ways that they interacted with their natural world, including animals. My favorite example of this is that the word for many is Asha, and it's written with a lizard. And if you've ever been to Egypt, that makes complete and total sense. There are lizards everywhere, and you will probably find one scurrying up your hotel room wall at one point. So the fact that they wrote the word many with a lizard, that just tells you something about how they interacted with their natural world.
That's fantastic. I love that. Question from Rachel. What was the environment like in ancient Egypt? Was it similar to how it is today? More or less vegetation? Do we even know?
Pretty similar in a lot of ways. Obviously, they didn't yet have the Aswan Dam, so the flood was a huge part of the culture. And this is again something that we're going to talk about in, you know, the day-to-day stuff. The entire culture basically depended on the Nile because it's the Nile and then desert. So, but with that, the Nile does provide some of the best soil on earth for agriculture. So even though it's only this like small strip of area that can provide abundancy, it provides abundancy. We also definitely know that they definitely stayed within the same area because archaeologically, this is why unfortunately we're mainly relegated to digging up tombs because people are living where they've always lived for thousands of years. They are living on the Nile. So in that way, in that sense, it's very similar. But even in ancient Egypt, they did try to control their and alter their environment a bit. For example, we wouldn't have the Fayum today if ancient Egyptians hadn't irrigated it. It is an oasis, but especially during the Middle Kingdom and then again during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, there was a huge amount of work put into irrigating that and creating it more agricultural area. So in that sense, yeah, it's very similar environment. Climate change has obviously created a lot of issues. And again, the Aswan Dam is probably the biggest change, that we no longer have the annual flooding, which was mostly pretty standard. Like, you could rely on it every year, but some years were bad, some years were good. But other than that, yeah, very similar.
Thank you. And one final question from April. She says, what do you think would be a story or custom that people don't know, but they should know?
Story or custom that they don't know that they should know. I don't even know. I guess, I've worked with this for so long, I'm not even sure how to answer that question.
Do you think that ancient Egypt is so, I don't want to say like as present as the classics in modern Western consciousness, but I feel like a lot of people have an understanding of ancient Egypt that maybe they do know like the basics?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest issue is also that so much of ancient Egyptian popular culture is influenced by modern biases. For example, just the understanding of wanting to connect like Atenism and Akhenaten to Moses and all of that, and that does come out of a very real place of trying to connect with an ancient culture, but it's often putting our modern biases onto that ancient culture and not looking at what they have. And that's even so, for example, one of my favorite examples of that too is for a long time, a lot of academic literature portrayed women in ancient Egypt who had tattoos, or even paddle dolls, which showed women with tattoos as probably being concubines. Turns out once you take away the modern bias of academics, no, they weren't. They were actually high priestesses of Hathor and had really important roles. That whole idea that, tattoo equals somehow bad, that entirely came from a modern idea. And once that even started changing in our modern culture, then we could kind of start stripping that away.
That's really interesting. I had no idea that was a thing.
Yeah, and especially on tattooing, there's a lot of great work being done right now, especially at, for example, Darrow Medina. There's a scholar, Ann Austin, who's working there. But things like that where modern ideas are being placed on ancient Egyptian culture, and it just skews everything. We're still working on that.
As is Assyriology, and I think every other study of the ancient world in modern circles. Well, I'm going to wrap it up. Jill, thank you so much for coming, for talking to me. It's lovely to see your face. Audience, thank you all for your questions. If you are interested in learning more about ancient Egyptian mythology, as I said, Jill's going to be teaching a course for us. The live version starts November 16th. You can find more information in the link in the description. And I should make it clear, I should have made this clear at the outset, you don't have to have any prior understanding or knowledge of ancient Egypt.
Yeah, no, in fact, actually, I've designed the course for people who have no prior knowledge. So I definitely will be trying to explain, very basic things. And this course, no 6-week course can give you a full overview. So I'll also be providing students suggested bibliography if they want to learn more, what books could tell them about what topics, that sort of thing.
Excellent. Thank you, Jill. Again, thank you, audience, for coming and bringing your questions, and we will see you next time. Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/Digital Hammurabi to see how you can help.